Okay, good afternoon, everybody. The title, obviously, UK economy, a full-blown crisis. As Jeremy's mentioned, I did one of these 2 years ago, towards the end of 2020, and at the time we used the word unprecedented quite a lot. It was justified, given it was the biggest drop in GDP for 300 years. Here we are 2 years later, and I think if you'd said 2 years ago, this is what the outcome will be towards the end of 2022, given where we are, I think there would have been some people who might not have agreed with that. Is it a crisis? Well, let's see. And I titled this when we were putting together what we would cover. I said, what a few weeks it's been. The government issues a mini statement. It sparks market turmoil, and then an extraordinary tax U-turn. And so at the time, it looked like, 2 weeks ago, we'd say there are some challenging questions. We've got forecast, well, we have actual and forecast minimal GDP growth. Is a recession imminent? Inflation is a major issue. It's a bigger issue than it's been since about 1994 in terms of size of the inflation rate. Is stagflation underway? I'll mention that verbally because in the context of the EU particularly. Higher interest rates and lower taxes, what's the impact? Well, it's now higher interest rates and higher taxes. And then finally, is there worse to come? And the reason for putting is there worse to come is, there's a motto, train hard, fight easy. And I think it's just to look at how people are viewing this through a very negative kind of prism, which isn't necessarily the right thing to do. Just bear with me 1 second. And I think it is easy to be overwhelmed and to think it's all just so negative, but we have to just look at this in a cool way. That's what economics does. Turn your heart off, turn your head on, and let's just look at it analytically. So what we'll look at is where's the UK, what's driving where the UK is, and then some of the issues around inflation, why it might be peculiar at the moment rather than, the world's ending, inflation's here forever. And then a bit about what happened with fiscal policy and the government's stance and why we've ended up with government changes so rapidly. And then finally, where do we think we're going? If you have any questions, put them in the chat room. If they're technical questions, we'll deal with them at the end. If they're quick and easy, I'll just deal with them straight off. Now, occasionally I might need to write on the screen. If I do that, I'll just mute my camera, just because it makes it easier for me to write on the screen. So first off, where's the UK? Well, we look at GDP growth. We can see, it's come down, obviously, but it's come down from that kind of ridiculous level it was at when we had the COVID-19 crisis. And we can see there's a major drop off of 21 percentage points and a recovery of 16.6. We get into January 2021, that's that second lockdown. And immediately we've begun to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. The second lockdown, if you speak to people how it affected them, lots of people felt it was really difficult, the second lockdown. But in terms of the economy, we'd already begun to work on how to deal with that. But we can see what's happened since then. The growth rates come down, and quarterly growth, so second quarter this year, 0.2%. But monthly growth was minus 0.3 in August. And the UK is now producing GDP figures 40 days after the end of a month. So you get to the end of September, and around about the 12th of October, you'll get GDP data for September. It's not as accurate as quarterly because we only have a partial data set, but it's a very, very, very good indicator of where the economy is going. Now, there'll be different people listening to this in terms of experience. And so what I would say is, if you're not familiar with GDP, it's like the gross salary or the net salary earned by you added up for the economy. So we looked at incomes, it would be all salaries and wages, all profits earned, all rent earned, and all interest earned. So GDP is the sum of all the incomes in the economy in a year, but it's also the sum of all expenditures or the sum of what we produce. It can all be made to equal each other. It does generally, with a little bit of a lag here and there, but it's effectively what the economy earned in a year. Now, we look at that and say 0.2% per quarter, is that low? And the answer is yes. Typically, if we go back to, say that period 1992 to 2007, the UK would have seen about 2.8% real GDP growth per annum. So 2.8 per annum in real terms. That means your income would have bought you 2.8 more. So let's say you earned £100 and a chocolate bar is £1. At the end of a year, you'd have been able to buy 102.8 and so on and so on. So at 0.2% for the quarter, roughly 0.8 to 1% for the year, we're way below where we would be normally in terms of average growth. So GDP is compressed. How do we look relative to others? Well, there's been a revision of data, and this is GDP in total, so in money terms, relative to quarter four 2019. So that was the final quarter before COVID-19, and it's up to the latest data. And there's been some revisions to the data, but what we can see, for example, is Canada is about 1.65% above pre-COVID level. France is around about 0.875. The US is about 2.55, 2.6, and the UK is just a little bit below, about 0.25%. So in other words, in money terms, our GDP isn't quite back to where it was. So two things to point out here. One, the level of money we've generated as an economy is not quite where it was pre-COVID. And two, it's growing at a below trend rate. Now, what's behind that? Well, the thing that drives the economy is what we call aggregate demand. It's the sum of expenditures by households, firms, and government, and net of exports, imports. So there are four big pillars of expenditure. And the biggest by far is consumers, where they occupy, in terms of total money spent, about 62, 63% of the UK economy. So what the consumer does is critical. If the consumer doesn't spend in the UK, then you're working very hard for the remaining 30% or 38% to pick up the baton and run with it. And so let's see what's behind some of this, because it's kind of interesting. Well, people's ability to spend and willingness to spend are key. So we talk about people or households' willingness to spend and ability to spend. And the ability to spend is driven by how much income you've got in a year to start with. There are other factors, but let's stick with that. And so two ways of looking at that is, how much do households have? What defines it? Well, it's driven in aggregate by the level of unemployment or employment. And what we can see here is the labour market is without doubt buoyant. Okay, without doubt, there are some huge numbers here. In terms of vacancies, so vacancies, there are 1.25 million. And with unemployment, it's 1.554 million. Now, that's a relatively rare event in my lifetime. We use these numbers, the vacancy and unemployment, we either do V by U or U by V. We get a ratio. If that ratio is 1, it means the number of people unemployed is equal to the number of vacancies. Now, it rarely gets to that. And at the moment, it's not, vacancies are 0.8 of unemployment, or unemployment is 1.25 times vacancies. Either way, there's a tight labour market. There are lots of jobs and there are lots of unemployed. Now, that would indicate to you that the economy is doing rather well. Now, part of the question we have to ask ourselves is, if that labour market's buoyant, the unemployment as a percentage is only 3.5%. It's lower than it's been since 1974. So why is that not translating? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. There's a lag between the unemployment rate and the way GDP works. So GDP can be changing, but the unemployment rate lags typically around about 18 months to 2 years. And I would change that nowadays to say 18 months to a year, just off the top of my head, because the way the labour market works in Britain is very flexible. Not as flexible as the US, but very flexible. And I think what that means is, if the company sees something turning down, so we see, you know, if Kaplan sees less students, you just think, okay, let's see how that pans out. If you go to the local sandwich bar in the city, you'd say, okay, we're left with some stock at the end of 3 o'clock at the end of the day, you know, at working lunchtime. It might just be a one-off. Let's see what happens if, you know, the rest of the month is the same. In other words, you don't start cutting back your orders of stock for sandwiches and laying off your staff until you're sure that downturn is more permanent. And so it's perfectly normal for the labour market to look in one condition and GDP to be another. And it typically happens around an inflection or a turning point. In other words, unemployment can be unemployment can be low, and GDP is high, but beginning to turn down. So there may just be a lag effect there. I think the other thing that's gone on is people just haven't been earning enough. If you look at real wages and the way they've changed, it's interesting. So what drives consumer spending is one of the things is ability to spend, and that's driven by your income stream. Okay. Expenditure is high, but not growing quickly. Why might that be? Well, as I'll come back to that in a second. If we take another look at the economy from a different way and say, what do we produce? We have and sorry, very quick question here. Somebody said, are the unemployment figures including people who are economically inactive? And the answer to that is no. Economically inactive means they are not, they're in the labor force, but not looking for a job. So when we talk about an unemployment figure, it means to the strict criteria of people who've looked at unemployed, been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks, and are available for work in the last 4 weeks. So it does not include economically inactive. Okay, good question. And if we look at the economy another way, in terms of what we produce, we not only manufacture, but we also undertake lots of service activity. And so on the output side, Britain and America share something. We're about 80% service driven. So whether that's football, going to a football match, going to the movies, going to a bar, a restaurant, having your hair done, going to a concert, hiring an accounting firm to do evaluation because you want to buy a company, all of these are services. And it's 80% of the UK economy. And so if we look at this quarterly data and monthly data, we can see that services dropped by 0.1%. Oh, sorry, I apologize. Okay, dropped 0.1% in August, which is not a big drop. But if you look at the sectors where it's beginning to happen, this is what's of concern. So if you want the link between the market being, the labour market being buoyant, but GDP beginning to turn, you start to look here. And so human health and social work, people might be cancelling a gym membership. They might not be going to have their teeth done or whatever. You're deferring dental appointments, medical appointments. Art, entertainment, recreation, accommodation and food services, other services. Those first four, which have seen a drop off, even though it's only small, are all people facing. So in other words, it looks like people are already beginning to substitute things that you do with services. And services are what we call income elastic. So in other words, when your income takes a shift from one pay band to another, you quite often spend a little bit more on things which are income elastic, we'd say. So in other words, going out, and I don't mean fine dining, I mean just stopping at Pizza Express on the way home from work. Things begin to look a little bit more unsecure. What you do is cut that back. And so I keep an eye on that service sector data. It comes out monthly, and there's a PMI for it as well, Purchasing Managers Index. And that's a real indicator of where we think we're going. So we've got to be careful with that. But nonetheless, so while the labour market looks really good, okay, I think one of the issues is we're kind of on that shift between GDP growth slowing. Businesses aren't yet cutting back, but as consumers are already beginning to pull back a little bit, that will translate into lower GDP and possibly a change in unemployment over the next 2 quarters. And one of the things I mentioned is it's not just the number of people in work. You can either have a given wage rate and a lot more people in work, the household sector can spend, or for a given number of people in work, wages can rise, the household sector has more ability to spend. And we can see here, this is real earnings. I'll just move that. And we can see total pay in August. I don't like that at all. Let's do that. So total pay in August in real terms, based on August, compared to August last year, was down minus 2.7%. And you can just see total pay real is the darker blue, regular pay real. Regular just means your standard wage, no overtime, bonuses, or anything else. And you look at the inflation rate, and it's not difficult to understand. If inflation is going up at 10% and you've had a 4% pay rise, you're losing 6 percentage points. And so we can see real earnings aren't great, but we can also see since about February 2009, we can see that real income, let's just stop for a second there, let's do that. So real incomes really come down, the credit crunch, flatline till about 15, begin to grow, come down again. And since then, they've picked up a little and then come back down again. And so I think we talk about hollowing out in the labour market, people just not seeing those pay rises. And I think it's been a really difficult period for people. And so if you're not getting paid more, then it's difficult to go out and spend. And so what's keeping the economy going is lots and lots of people in work who are not necessarily seeing an increase in their pay. And so I think, in a nutshell, households' ability to spend is compromised. Okay, that's in a nutshell.
Roy, can I break the golden rule on asking questions? In terms of that inflation figure and what's causing it, are they the normal factors that cause inflation, if you see what I mean, in layman's terms, or is this slightly unusual or exceptional?
That's a very interesting question, Jez. And I think, sorry, Jez, calling you Jez after 30 years. There are two parts to that, and I'd say it's 2/3, 1/3. And I've got a couple of slides coming up which try and put a bit of meat around that and show why it's a slightly peculiar situation. But it will also show why the 1/3 causal factor is a bit of a return to the 70s. And for somebody my age, 63, it's kind of difficult to see this. But there is a peculiar thing, because it's not just the UK, as we'll see. And just before we do that, let me ask a question. So effectively, households, there's lots of people in work, but their real incomes are not rising quickly enough to sustain a big increase in expenditure. Let's ask a question here. And if you just say yes or no, that'll do fine, and we can pick up the responses. Do you think it's a good time to buy a consumer durable over the next 12 months?
So yes or no is what we're looking for in the chat box, nice and quick. So consumer durable might be labour saving.
Yeah, consumer durable is, a washing machine and a dishwasher and a tumble dryer make your life easier, or a new flat screen TV and surround sound with the World Cup coming up.
I was going to say DVD, but that ages me, doesn't it? I think you can see those coming through, Roy, but I was going to summarise it for you, but I think there are a whole lot more no's than yeses. I'd say about 90% no at the moment. Okay.
Well, if people are saying no, I can kind of understand that, because that leads to the second part of what's going on. It's not just the ability of consumers to spend, it's the willingness. And the willingness is driven by confidence. And we measure confidence every month. And this is UK confidence, the standard UK confidence measure from a company called GfK. And GfK stands for Growth from Knowledge. And they do a really big consumer confidence survey every month. It's at record lows, basically. The one thing we can say is it did pick up by +2 to -47. It was at -49. And effectively, consumer confidence is flawed. Now, that sounds dramatic. It's not. But the key thing to understand is, in some ways, it doesn't matter how much people have. If they're not confident enough to spend, there isn't much you can do to make them spend. And that is a key problem. So one of the reasons why there was such a kind of clamour for changes in government, which, whether you like it or not, or agree with it or not, is there was a need for some sort of stability. And what the financial markets were doing was indicating we didn't have enough stability. So from the viewpoint of the household sector, it is interesting that people's ability to spend is compromised in terms of real pay growth. But in addition to that, confidence levels are really, really low. Okay, and that is, being 62% of the demand side of the economy, is having an effect on the amount we try and spend. One of the other problems we've got, of course, is we've got a high inflation rate. And we can see that inflation is 10.1%. Core inflation underneath is the same inflation measure, but we strip out food and fuel and energy, because they're driven by the factors. And the key thing is, even though you withdraw those kind of seasonal or one-off factors, they're subject to one-off events. What we can see is the direction of travel is upwards. Now, you could, of course, be a good statistician and say that bit looks a bit flatter than the first part, and I'd kind of run with that. But the inflation rate of 10% is quite high. Now, I'll come back to inflation in a second. Jeremy's question is this due to normal kind of economic relationships, or is this due to something else? And it is due to a couple of, well, quite a few things, but one of them is we've had two major global supply shocks. The first one was COVID-19, which saw just a cessation of activity. And what that means is China was locking down, the West is locking down, China's producing, but you can't get ships to carry what they're producing to the biggest market it supplies outside of its own, which is the West. And secondly, all the containers that are here are full and nobody's at work, so you're not emptying them. So we had containers in the wrong places and ships in the wrong places. And the price of containers rocketed hugely. And shipping rates really rose. And this just gave us a major shock. The second part of that was because we had lockdown, people were not buying, we're not going out to get their haircuts, not going to restaurants, and we're stuck at home. So everybody then wants, I'm going to upgrade the flat screen, I'm going to get a sound bar, I'm going to get a new computer because I'm watching, Netflix on the go and so on and so forth. So we saw a big increase in demand for goods rather than services. Well, goods require resources, and most of those goods are manufactured overseas, be it in places like Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, Italy, or in the Far East. And so we saw goods inflation. And so it basically gave us a big shift in the supply curve. And that caused a major issue. As the impact of that may begin to have come down, we've then had the problem with the war in Europe between Ukraine and Russia. So we've had this big supply shock. And that supply shock generated a one-off hit, but sustained hit in prices for several months. However, normally we'd say, just go back to that, given that inflation is double digit, what would we expect interest rates to do? We'd expect them to come down. Well, if interest rates go up to get inflation down, okay, fine, we can think that might be a way forward. It makes borrowing more expensive, makes consumer credit more expensive. So, we don't take consumer credit and so on and so forth. We don't change the television. We'll put up with it for the World Cup, even though it's only 4K, etc. But there's evidence coming through that the inflation from the supply side shock may be beginning to come down. And these are different freight indices. The Baltic Exchange Dry Index, these are great indices. And you can see here they're indexed to May 2020, indexed to 100. The Baltic is shipping so dry cargo, not in container ships. So grain, clothing, and so on and so forth. And the Harpex and the Freightos are both container indices. Now, they're different because they ask different players in the supply chain for their prices. Some may ask freight forwarders, some may ask shipping agents, or they may ask the actual shipping lines. So you get a difference. But the key from that chart is that you can see a peak. Now, the Baltic, i.e. normal goods, recovers really quickly into Jan 22. But that's because it doesn't use containers and it doesn't need container ships. The shortage of containers and containers being in the wrong part of the world are what led to that much slower recovery in the Baltic. Okay, and now the Freightos Baltic, and then the much slower recovery in the Freightos. But the key thing is twofold. One, at peak, you're looking at peaks of 6 and 7 times the price of shipping. We're now back at about 3 times, 2.25 times. Still big, but there's a big easing off. And so one of the things we might be doing is raising interest rates to choke off inflation. And the inflation is caused by an external factor. Changing the interest rate in Britain has no impact on shipping rates, nil. So I can see why the Bank of England was a bit reluctant to go in too quickly with big interest rate rises, because the inflation was being driven by, a chunk of it was driven by external effects. And for example, if people trying to buy a car last year were struggling with the lead time, and so secondhand car prices rocketed. And that's because of chip shortages. And if we look at this, price of computers, again, look at that peak, the annual inflation rate gets to 5, 10, getting towards 15%. Second-hand cars, so as the price of those new cars does that, the follow-on is the price of second-hand. And it's not just the price of new cars, remember, it's the availability. It's all very well being able to afford it, but if you can't find one, what's the point? So the price of second-hand cars rocketed, and notice they're dropping back down towards normal. So in answer to Jeremy's question, yeah, inflation was really, it jumped, but it took a while getting there. And that's because there's a transmission mechanism. It's only as the goods arrive in Britain, having taken 6 to 8 weeks to get from China normally, they may have taken 3 months, 6 months during lockdown and the immediate aftermath. So the price increases were always getting delayed and come through later after the lockdown had ended. And so I think what I'm saying is this: we're using a monetary variable, interest rates, to try and control the structural impact on inflation. That may or may not be the right call. And with that in mind, here's a question. At the 10% annual rate of inflation, which of the following is the amount of time it would take a sum of money to halve in real value terms? So £100 buys you, let's call a chocolate bar £1. You've got £100, it buy you 100 chocolate bars. How long would it take at 10% inflation for it to only buy you 50 chocolate bars? So is it A, 5.2 years, B, 7.2, C, 9.2, or D, 11.2? So I'll give you a minute or two, or a minute to have a think about that. So how long do you think it would take your money to halve in value with an inflation rate of 10%?
A combination of numbers and letters will decipher those.
Well, anyone who did IMC, CFA, all of them, the multi-choice exams, it'll be, I'm sorry if it brings back horrible memories, but it's a useful little tool.
Cover the screen now, Roy, so you get a surprise.
Well, I'm not looking out, I'm not checking, so let's see.
I'm going to have a good old scroll in a second. There is a little bit of a mixture, I'd say. At the moment, A is winning.
Oh.
Last few coming through. Lots of A's, actually, I think.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
Okay, I think one new message. Yeah, I think if I had to pick the winner, it would be A. There are some B's and C's as well. So that's
interesting.
Find out the scores on the doors. Over to you, Roy.
Well, before I say anything, if I do this with people with no financial background, they typically go longer. But the answer is 7.2. And when I first began to lecture in the city, which is even before I met Jez, was 1995, we didn't have, well, we did have computers, but we just didn't use them the same way. But the answer is 7.2. We used to talk about the rule of 7.2, which was things halve effectively in value in at 10%, 7.2 years. So at 5%, it's around about 14 years. But it's not that long, is the key. And interestingly, for those of you who believe it was 5.2 years, making investment decisions, I would say you'd be looking to get money back as quickly as you could, or do something as quickly as you could in order to try and preserve the value of what you've got. And interesting, this is a taster. I'm going to go until 20 past, Jez, and then we'll deal with questions. That's right, because we a little bit of a glitch there at the beginning. But just to bear in mind, one of the things that's emerged in parallel to what we saw in 07. In 07, we realized we didn't have quite the right numbers sometimes to enable us to see just how the banking system had dealt with mortgages, mortgage arrears, and types of bonds. Now we have much more numbers in place. And what we have now, post the credit crunch, it still has an effect even now. Post what's happened with COVID, there's now this index. Now, for those of you, and some of you may have listened to me do this last time, and I'd mentioned last year the emergence of this GSCPI, the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. It started as an academic paper. It was very well done, and it was updated a bit, and it effectively looks at orders. So what's the orders? How many new orders are companies getting? What's the backlog of orders? What's the inventory they've got? And it looks at PMI indices, various indices. There's about 8 variables all combined into a single number. And it gives us an index value for effectively how much of a logjam there is in the global supply chain. And the beauty of that is it allows us to just look at one figure, which encapsulates all those influences. And it's the deviation from an average. So here we can see, you get into the start of 2022, it's 4 and a bit standard deviations away from an average. That's going some. One of the things we talk about sometimes in numbers is a 6 standard deviation event. That is incredibly unlikely. So here, to be 4 standard deviations away in 2021 into 22 is telling you that is a major problem. And so because the UK is, 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world, depends who you ask, but we're a very open traded economy. We are at the whim, if you like, of trade. And so anything which causes a logjam has a real effect on us. So bear that in mind. And if you go on this website, it's now published as a data feed, and it's updated and indexed by the New York Fed. If you go on that website, if you're interested, there's a video explaining how that index works. But that's now just going to become a normal data feed for us. But in terms of that inflation, to echo what the question Jez asked, you can see as well, the UK isn't an inflation outlier. So this is the US, UK, so France, Germany, Italy, US, and then CPI for UK. It's matters of degree, but we've all seen since that period that increase the same way. And you can see down here, we're all hovering around, right, in a kind of 1%, 1.25% at the start of September 20. That's because the logjam afforded by COVID hasn't come through yet. Okay, it hasn't come through. And so it's not just the UK position, it's happening to other countries as well. Now, one of the issues we've got, Jeremy said, is it one-off factors or is it something else? Well, what also matters is what's called the transmission mechanism. Now, in the 1970s, when most of you probably weren't even around, we used to worry terribly about wage price spirals. And this was, we had much more unionized workforces. And what we would find was that someone like Ford's could go on strike and say, we want this, that, and the other in terms of pay rise. I remember companies at the time giving 30% pay rises over 2 years, but huge. And so part of the reason for the inflation rate to go up is to try and, if you like, get in before that kind of wage spiral hits. Okay. And we're not unionized now, but the impact of data means we can find out very quickly what jobs are going on where and what the demand is like. And what that means is you may not be unionized, but you can see there's big demand for, 3D digital designers for interface. Okay, well, we all negotiate our own contracts these days. And so I think the Bank of England's trying to step in. Why? Well, we can see, as we pointed out, if you're a pensioner or a fixed income or you own bonds, it hammers you. Those of you who said you wouldn't buy a consumer durable, I'm not allowed to give advice. But if you bought something from someone like Peter Jones, you can get 1 year to 2 year interest-free credit. Well, if inflation is 10% over the next 12 months, and then 6% the year after, somebody's allowing you to buy a 4K television now, and at interest-free for 2 years, it'll be worth 16% less than money you give at the end of 2 years. So one of the things inflation can do is bring demand forward and give us a shock in terms of what people spend. So borrowers getting the expense of lenders, generally be in debt when inflation is high. If inflation expectations get embedded, it's difficult to remove them. And you just end up with nominal values rising, but no real change in real values. It weakens a currency, it makes you look very difficult to deal with. You've got to try and deal with that because you get a run on the currency. But there's also a time lag between the interest rate change and the impact on that inflation. And so one of the issues, the Bank of England was on the tightrope of, if the inflation is driven by a supply side shock, as those shocks unwind, will we not then see inflation come down? In which case, if you're raising rates, if they were raising rates at the start of this year, we may have seen inflation beginning to fall back next year when interest rate rises are coming through. And that's why it delayed them. And that is just a very difficult call. It really is.
Roy, just very quickly, there is a question about the impact of the mini budget in the chat panel. I don't know whether this is a good time to drop it in or whether you want to pick that one up at the end.
Yep, that's a fantastic question. I'll read the question out. I don't know if it's got. Oh, it's gone to. Has it gone to everybody?
Hosts and panelists. So I'll cover that one for you if you like. Politicians are saying that Liz Truss has ruined the UK economy following the mini budget. How to my understanding, the mini budget was to cut taxes so people had more disposable income. Most of this has now been reversed. So can you briefly elaborate on why it had such an impact?
I don't just throw this together in the next few slides. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just acutely aware of the time. Yeah, I'm about to deal with that, believe it or not. And this is, in fact, the specific slide. What I might do is I'll pull the screen down and just kill my camera while I deal with it. Basically, we're talking about fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is changes in the levels of government expenditure and taxation in the economy. This is set by a budget round 3 to 5 years in advance. So, you're setting the budget for 3 years out, and then it's rolling. We talk about active fiscal policy. Oh, apologies. Which is the government changes taxes and government spending actively to meet an anticipated position in the business cycle or to meet a situation. So the government paying people's wages during COVID-19 was extremely active fiscal policy. Okay, undertaking energy cap help is extremely active fiscal policy. Passive is you set the levels of taxation and government spending and just let those adjust over the business cycle. So in other words, given the tax rates, as the economy booms, unemployment falls, the government deficit actually might become a surplus because they're getting more people are in work, they're earning money, the government saves unemployment benefits and other housing benefits and so on, and begins to get taxation from people in work. So during a boom, typically the government should have a much lower deficit or have a surplus, but during a recession, the reverse is true. And the two numbers we use to check where we are is what's the budget deficit doing, which is tax revenue minus government spending. Now we use two measures here. The deficit, so the annual deficit to GDP, the amount the government borrowed in the current year as a percent of GDP. That's like your overdraft as a percent of a salary. And because it's per annum, it's a flow. But then we say, if the government's run a number of deficits, it'll have been borrowing, the debt will have increased. And so we also look at outstanding government debt to GDP. And that's like looking at your mortgage, because it's a 25-year mortgage, relative to your annual salary. So if you're earning 50 grand and your mortgage is 500K, that ratio is 10. And we do that once a year, that's a stock measure. So in other words, the market looks at two things. What's your annual deficit relative to your annual salary or GDP, and what's your outstanding debt relative to your income? Excuse me. Now, there's a question here. Have we got time to do it, Jeremy? What do you think?
I was about to come on and say, I'm looking at my clock at the moment, but let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay.
I'll keep it nice and quick. So congratulations to those that picked B last time. You're on for a double now. Which of the following countries has the highest government debt? So in English, what you owe to GDP, what you earn, I guess that would be.
It's perfect, Jez.
Thank you very much. It's all coming rushing back to me.
Yeah, economics is like having teeth pulled for most people. They don't want to.
Lots of D's. Italy, D. So D is definitely the persuasive answer. Got an A in there as well, Germany, but mostly D's got a C in there too. But so a smattering of the others, but D comes out as the favourite, Roy.
Okay, let's see. So it is in fact Italy is 1. Germany is 4. UK is 3. And the USA is 2. But again, one of the problems with this, it depends how you measure it. But the bottom line is we're not the worst. You'd think we were the way people are talking, but we're not the worst. I'm going to skip one slide, but people have the slides after, they can read it through and ask me afterwards. But let's get this in context. We can see that we get to 2009 and there's a big leap. And then that's COVID. If we put it in historical context, you can see below, there's clearly post-World War II was desperate, but then it just mirrors. So, we're up at around about 100%. But if you look at how long it took us to deal with the impact of World War II, it took a long, long time. It really did take a long time. So in historical context, it's, not as high as it has been, but it is high, and it's the speed with which it's doubled effectively from 2009 to today. Now, the question asked, I'll skip that one. It just shows that it's happened to everybody. What was the impact of the government's policy? Now, you're right that cutting income tax puts more money in people's pockets, and it does. But the issue with that is it assumes that if you give people that income tax break, they spend it. Well, for every pound of extra income you give them, they will spend it, but a chunk of that, about 15%, will go on imports. And the idea from this comes from the Laffer curve, that if you allow people to keep more of the income they've earned, it incentivizes them to spend a bit more, but also it incentivizes people to innovate and become entrepreneurs and so on. The jury's out. But the issue with what was happening with the way it was introduced by the government was that given the level of employment, given the level of average wages and the level of spend, we could work out that given what our tax take would be, and effectively the government was going with a tax cut, which in the short term certainly would have caused a hole in the public finances. And the idea being that over time, the impact of those tax cuts feeds through into a higher demand, the economy produces more employment, people's wages rise, and we start getting a bigger tax take that begins to balance out. That hinges on so many assumptions it's not true, but one of them, not least, is something called the multiplier for a tax break, or a tax change. Now, can I do this without, no, I'll stick with. To borrow, or to finance these, the government borrows from the markets. And it borrows from the markets, and it issues gilts. Now, these are gilt auctions. It tells the market what it will borrow, when it will borrow it, and how much money you'll pay on the borrowing. So if I just take an example here, if we take this, auction on the 19th of October for a 1% coupon gilt. So that means it's £100 gilt. The government, for as long as you own it for the next decade, you'll get £1 a year of interest. So here's the same gilt. It was issued in on auction on 15th of February, and the government issued 2.25 billion of those gilts. So various investors bought them. And you can see there's the price. Investors paid £94.51p. And that gives a yield of about 1.59%, so 1.6%. Okay, 1.6%. Now, let's have a think about what that means. We're picking on a 10-year bond. We normally pick on a 10-year because that's the reference rate. 19th of October, post-mini budget, and it's a month later, I could have picked a more dangerous one. There's the same bond getting issued. And look how much investors are paying. Oh, excuse me. Right, they're paying £76 and a yield of 4.109. In other words, so if you look at the first auction, the government's getting £94.51 in the 100. So it's giving away £5.50. If you look what's happening here, it's giving away £24. In other words, investors were far less willing to buy those government bonds on that date, post the mini budget, because the market said, you're a government, you're willingly increasing the size of the deficit, and it's a shortfall, and you're borrowing money to fund a tax cut. Now, the golden rule in finance, I trained accountants for years, I did Jeremy. You always match the maturity of the asset with the life of the finance. What does that mean? You don't use an overdraft to buy a house. You don't use your mortgage to go on holiday. You use your mortgage to buy an asset with a long life, 25-year mortgage, long life house. Take out an overdraft, go on holiday, got a year to pay it back. It looked like the government was effectively advocating borrowing money to finance short-term expenditure rather than capital expenditure. And it was based on and we think the economy will grow because we cut taxes and eventually we'll get more money. Well, you're asking people to lend you money for, all the way out to 2071. They just wouldn't do that. And what happened was, this is the cost of borrowing. And you can see it gets up to about 4.48%. Now, what that means is the following. This is just around about the mini budget. What that means is the yield on government debt rocketed. And that means going forward, every time the government wanted to issue a bond, it would have had to pay around about £4.50 in the 100. Well, if you look at that bond I've just picked up, it's £1 in the 100 as a coupon. But even there, it's only about 2% yield. It's doubled there to 4. So basically, we exist on a big deficit because of the kindness of strangers. The British economy is the 5th biggest in the world. Lots of foreign investors like to hold British government currency. Lots of foreign investors like to hold British government debt. We can only borrow as long as they're willing to do that. And what it looked like is we were interpreted by the market as playing fast and loose with our deficit. And that's why they brought such pressure to bear. And if inflation's falling, why is there upward pressure on rates? Well, just a couple of things here. The return on gilts is known as the risk-free rate. What does that mean? It means it's the safest asset you can buy. You can go and buy gilts. You can go and buy gilts yourself at the post office. That's not advice, by the way. Okay, the government doesn't default. So if an advisor is trying to persuade you to part with money, you can say, well, the minimum you want is risk-free because you can get that yourself. And any other asset can be valued in that way. You can say the minimum return you want is risk-free plus a premium. But here's the thing. The Treasury and the Bank of England are both arms of the government. They're equally riskless. So one of the things to think about is this. The base rate is currently 2.25, and yet the 10-year rate was looking at about 4.45. But that's the base rate today, 2.25. Okay. And if I look at a 1-year government bond today, it's yielding 3.104. So that's a 1-year bond. Sorry about the writing, but I'm not using the screen very well. So look, they're both equally riskless. The base rate's 2.25 from the Bank of England. 1-year government bond is yielding 3.104 at the close of play yesterday. If I'm a bank, and the Bank of England is the banker's bank, if I'm a bank with a very good credit rating, I could effectively borrow from the Bank of England at 2.25 and buy a British government bond yielding 3.104. I'm making 85 basis points. That's arbitrage. Now, the fact that those two numbers exist, the market's in equilibrium, it is telling you that the market is pricing in roughly a 75 basis point rate rise tomorrow. So the reason that shift in yield post the mini budget was so awkward is because it pushes up rates big time, and there's a relationship between the government, the yield on government bonds, and the base rate, and that was getting out of kilter. But it was also telling us that the market was pricing in the UK needed interest rates of around about 4.5% to control inflation. That's why it caused so many ructions. Now, there's more detail and more time to explain that. If you want to know more, you can ask me afterwards. But the link between the two is very critical. And then finally, and I'll do conclusions. In 2016, the UK economy was valued at 90%. So is the worst to come, let's say. The UK economy was valued at 90% that of Germany. Which of the following is the most recent estimate of the size of the UK relative to that of Germany? So in 2016, for every 100 the German economy generated, we generated 90. What do we think it is today?
And you've got 5 seconds.
Well,
let's have a look.
Anyone take a punt? Oh my word.
Lots of initial Ds. Lots of initial Ds. C's and D's?
Yeah, I mean, it's been mentioned in a number of places, but it was mentioned by Mark Carney in Lunch with the FT. I mean, look, we could argue that because it depends how it's measured. I reran the numbers this morning using a different measure, and based on constant US dollars, 2015 US dollars, I got 86% and then 73%. So it depends how we do it. But the bottom line is the UK has underperformed for certainly the last 6 years, I'd say, post 2016. Is it a full-blown crisis? Well, look, GDP is below pre-COVID levels with slow growth. The recession is imminent, I think. Falling real earnings, low ability to spend, higher interest rates hitting households, mortgages go up, less money to spend, less ability. Confidence is down, less willingness. And then the government is going to raise taxes and cut spending. So that's going to take a big chunk of demand out of the economy. That inflation was driven by supply side shocks. The pound has been weakened because our inflation rate was high quicker, but also because we looked like we were struggling to get a grip on things politically. The pound weakens, that makes import costs higher. That gives another shock to the inflation side. It's going to take a while to fall back to the target range. We will have stagflation for a short time because of that lag between employment and inflation. Higher interest rates and lower taxes now won't happen simultaneously. We're going to have higher interest rates and higher taxes. Either tax rates will rise and or the threshold for when you pay tax will not be adjusted. So as wages rise over the next 4 years, more people go into the higher tax bracket. Is there worse to come? I think GDP growth will be slow for a while for some time after the recession. We'll have a recession, I think, it'll be about a year in duration, and then growth will pick up more slowly into 24. There may be a wealth effect. Interest rates go up, house price values fall, people's wealth drops. So there's a knock-on effect there, particularly. We've got to be careful. We now have stability. The 10-year yield, or the yield on a 10-year bond has come down. So people are pricing Sunak in as less risk. I think that ongoing repercussions from the conflict in Ukraine, that's a different lecture. But global debt levels overall are increasing. One of the issues I worry about is if that comes home to roost. On the upside, British government debt is on average 15 years long. So that's one economic cycle before we have to pay half the debt. So that's a very good position. 2, retail looks like it's coming back a bit. So the rate of store closures is falling and niche stores, independents, are beginning to come back a bit. 3, the economy is way more flexible than it's ever been before. And so one of the things we might see, therefore, if there is a recession, it may be relatively short, so 4 quarters. And I think the thing everybody has to think about is if that war in Ukraine ends, pressure on energy prices really drops off. So there are 4 things I think to be more optimistic about rather than just being negative. I've overrun by 2 minutes. I will stop there. Sorry.
I know, I was going to say, Amber, yeah, we've been optimistic on our coverage, and so we are up to time. But I'd like to, if we can, just try and take the initial questions. I kind of paused one on the way through, and then we've got another one that's come through. So if you do have questions, feel free to pop them in chat. And if you have got time to hang on, we have 2. So we'll try and satisfy curiosity, and then I'll do a quick roundup at the end. So KD, apologies for not dropping it in real time. So there was a question that came through earlier, Roy, about trickle-down economics, and basically saying it doesn't work, question mark.
Well, it's interesting. I was taught by Patrick Minford in my first year and my third year in 1978. Fantastic academic, great lecturer. I've seen him recently at reunions. The objective is a smaller state. And so one of the reasons we have privatizations is in order to say, to allow the allocation of resources to be made by economics rather than politics. And you could say, well, in terms of British Telecom, phenomenal success. Far more telecoms installed than imaginable 40 years ago. Water privatization, rail, not so sure. In terms of tax, you get odd effects. So, for example, you look at GPs at the moment. One of the things that happened with GPs, their salary went up, and it looks like you get a backward bending supply curve. In other words, they earn more, but because they can have a similar lifestyle to what they had before with less effort, GPs are, not doing as many hours, it seems. So I don't know. The jury is out on trickle down. My head says the data is at best ambiguous. The data is ambiguous. And I could get data from both sides to show both sides that it works. But I think the level of interconnectedness of the planet and economies, I think the ability to be able to stand out like that is different. it's also a race to the bottom. Ireland is in a fantastic position with a corporation tax rate of 12.5%. But if we all start doing that, then you just end up with a lower tax take. So I, on balance, generally don't think it works. And I think it's a relatively short-term effect. Well, if it does work, it's a short-term sugar rush effect. You've got to look at UK productivity. Our productivity is just way below other people's. That's what we need to be looking at, I think, rather than, and structure the tax for that, rather than structuring it to kind of get money in people's pockets and see if they can spend it. So on balance, no, I think on balance, it doesn't work the way described.
Lovely. I've got two that I think might be quite quick, actually. Let's have a look. You mentioned house prices falling. When do you expect us to see that? Question mark.
Depending on what you read, it's already beginning to come through. We're now in the winter period. And one of the problems with the winter period, if you look at the pattern of demand for new mortgages, you get two big hits really: spring, April, May, June, and again in September. April, May, June, you move and then you move. The kids go to a new school in September, or people coming back from holiday. One of the problems we have with trying to gauge when it will come is you don't get many house price moves over the winter period. But there's two things to look for. I can do the equation. I'd have to rearrange the screen. But house prices move because if a given housing stock turns over faster, or same housing stock, but lower turnover of housing stock and we add more houses. We don't add many more houses. So house price rises come from a turnover in the housing stock, number of transactions per year. I think you'll see the number of transactions fall in the final quarter and into quarter one next year. And if we see the number of new mortgages given is lower in quarter four and into quarter one next year, then I see those house prices coming in at the start of quarter two next year. And don't hang me if I'm wrong, but there's a transmission mechanism where the volume of transactions has to come off first.
Super. And I think last one actually, Roy. How do you define recession? Negative GDP growth or the wishy-washy way the Fed has described it?
Well, for me, it's two successive quarters of negative GDP growth is what I'm looking for. It's been a good enough definition for a long time, and I'm not sure I see any reason to change it, I have to say. No, I'd go with that. And so actually, somebody's asked the Brits just lazy. The answer to that is no. But, oh, it stopped. Did I just kill the presentation? How do I go back to that? But no, Brits aren't lazy. I just think we need skills in different areas of the economy, and that's a difficult thing to get. A very difficult thing, because it doesn't just happen. You know, with 1.25 million vacancies and 1.5 million people unemployed, there should be some interplay between the two. But it appears there's a mismatch between where the vacancies are and where the people are. For example, where I live in West London, there's a restaurant called La Trompette. It's a Michelin star. It can only open Wednesday to Saturday because it can't do lunch and dinner with the staff it's got. It can't get the right staff, be that kitchen staff or front of house.
Lovely. And I think I'm just conscious we're 8 minutes over at the moment, so I think I'm just going to gently draw things to a close. And so firstly, Roy, thank you as ever. Fascinating and good to have you on the call. So thank you for that. I hope everybody has found it interesting. And thanks for taking part in the chat and the questions. I don't know whether you can get that last slide back up at the moment, Roy. Finished with a technical glitch and started with one as well. If not, don't worry, because we're going to circulate the recording afterwards. But just a few quick points to finish. I spoke earlier at the start of the call about in-house non-exam training, and in the slide deck on the last slide there is a QR code, and so if you do want more information about the breadth of courses that we deliver, then please do click on the QR code, which will be in the slide deck in the follow-up, and all that information is there for you. I've just popped a survey link, a feedback link into the chat box actually, and again we will follow up with this, but if you've got 5 minutes now and you want to just give us some feedback on the session, it's always great for us to know what you thought, and obviously we're always looking for ways to improve it. So if you do want to fill that in now, then please do. So that's just in the chat box at the moment. If you've enjoyed this session and you'd like to come on more, or you've been on more previously, then in the new year, we're going to be doing another ESG session. And so look out for details of that, which we'll send out when we get back after Christmas. And also, just by way of a follow-up email, we're also going to introduce, we're going to include some of Roy's favorite websites, bit of information. So if you do want to read around some of the subject matter that we've covered today, then all of that information will be coming to you. So again, look out for that email. And so with that, as ever, thank you for taking part. Thank you for attending, and we will catch up with you again, hopefully in the new year. So that's over and out from us. And thanks very much, Roy.
Thanks so much indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye. Why did that happen? Why did that happen?